Today we are reading from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. Since the law has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the reality itself of those things, it can never perfect the worshippers by the same sacrifices they continually offer years after year.
Thank you very much, Jaden. And I don't know if you noticed, you probably did, but I had the song lyrics up on the screens, the sheet music and everything. I noticed that there's some verses that one has that we don't have, and there's ones that we have that they don't have, but we'll figure all that out. All right, let's see. I just thought it looked better than it being just like a black screen up there for the first 15 minutes. So, all right. Today we're going to go back to our study in Leviticus, and we've looked at so far chapters 1 through 4 and the various offerings that are talked about there. But today what we're going to do is talk about chapters 5 and 6 with the sin offering and the guilt offering. One of the questions that we've asked ourselves over the past few weeks is, why study such an ancient book? Why study a book that is filled with sacrifices and these animals being killed for the sins of the people and all these kind of things? It just seems kind of old, and do we even really need this anymore? And do we really need all this ritual? After all, that's the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant's passed away. We're under the New Covenant. What does it matter studying all this stuff? Well, that's what we're going to see today. We're going to have a perfect example of this. Let me go check one thing. Yeah, so we're going to start in chapter 4, my bad. We looked at chapters 1, 2, and 3, but we're going to start in chapter 4 and move into chapter 5 and 6. So first we're going to start in chapter 4. Talk about the two sin offerings. We have a sin offering, we have a guilt offering. Beginning in verse 1, the scripture says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and commits any of them, if the anointed priest sins so as to bring guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord a bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed." So just a couple notes here. Notice this is about unintentional sin. So just because you sin unintentionally does not mean that you're free from guilt of that sin. Does that make sense? Let me explain why. Let's say you did not mean to. Let's see. What's one of these sins we can focus in on? Let's say you didn't mean to tell a lie. Let's say that someone told you information, you thought that it was true, and you presented it to someone as the truth. Now, really, that thing was a lie. So you've lied. You didn't know that you lied, but you still lied. Now, that might not make you have a guilty conscience, but one day down the road, if you discover that what you told was a lie, now you're going to be, you'll feel a little bit bad about that. You'll feel bad that you passed on false information, right? Why do you think that God requires the individuals who've committed unintentional sins to bring forth offerings whenever they find out that they've committed a sin? Here's why. That lie affects somebody, right? If I'm told a lie about Gary, and I spread that lie to other people with full confidence that it's the truth, and it turns out not to be true, what has that done to him and to his reputation? You see? And so even though these people may have committed unintentional sins, God requires them to bring forth guilt offerings whenever they do make those sins in order to make things right. Well, there's more to it than just that, though. Let's keep reading. So in verse 3 we have, this is what happens if the anointed priest sins. In verse 4, he's going to bring the bull. In verse 5, he's going to take some blood of the bull. In verse 7, he's going to sprinkle some blood on the altar. He's going to remove the fat in verse 8. He's going to take the kidneys in verse 9. And he does this, and he does this, and he does this. And all of it, you see, is very repetitious. One thing that I haven't commented on is the purpose of the repetition in Leviticus. Whenever we read this passage and we read, all these things over and over and over again, it kind of becomes sort of mundane. We think, well, yeah, Lord, we got that. Yeah, we understand. Okay, yeah, you take the blood and you take this and you drop it there and you drop it there, and sure, we got you. Why do you have to say it, the same way 5 different times? Back then, they didn't have the printing press, did they? How did they copy the Bible? They had to copy it by hand with scribes, one letter at a time. Whereas we throw the papers on a copy machine and we have it. Or even in today's world, it's even more severe than that. If you want a copy of the Bible, you don't even have to have a physical copy. You can sit down at a computer and find one online. You can pull up a phone or a tablet or sit in a congregation that has a TV screen and just read it right off of there. And so so for us, repetition isn't as necessary. But for a community that requires the memorization and the oral passing on of these teachings, because not everybody has a pocket Bible that they can just pull out of their, they have one on their coffee table, one on their nightstand, and one in their car that they keep, and one on the pew. Not everybody has that. And so back here in ancient Israel, the reason for the repetition is so that they can remember it, so that they can pass it on and teach other priests, pass it on and teach the people. And it kind of has sort of a song-like quality to it. When we're singing a song, you naturally go from verse to chorus, right? What happens whenever I like to do it with that song, At the Cross, Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed, right there at the start of the book. I know Gary does it sometimes. I think I've heard Johnny do it maybe, where we say, you know what? We're going to sing the chorus at the end and sing all the verses at the start. What does somebody invariably do? They start that chorus right at the end of the first verse, because we're used to patterns and repetition, and we've learned to recognize these things, and we've just become accustomed to them. So what God did for the first century, very, very first generation of Israelites coming out of Exodus, is he gave them this song-like pattern to the sacrifices. First you take the bull, then you do this, and then you take the blood here, and then you take it to this altar, and you sprinkle it here. And it kind of burns it into your memory. Right now we think, why do you need repetition? Just open it up to chapter 1 and read it again whenever you want to. They didn't have that privilege. When they left the synagogue, more in the first century context, or when they left the tabernacle, they needed some way to hold on to those scriptures, and so they committed them to memory. So the first part of Leviticus 4 starts off with a priest. Notice that the priests, the top people in Israel, are not excluded from offering up guilt offerings. They're not excluded from sin. Doesn't our society need something like this? Why is it that it seems that that whenever someone who is in the middle class or lower class commits some kind of issue with taxes or some other sort of crime, that it seems like they're immediately punished with no questions asked? But if someone who is in a more affluent family, or maybe the son of a politician, or maybe someone who is CEO of a company, why does it seem like they get away with a little bit more than other people do? Why does it seem like someone can be corrupt through and through and not receive any kind of punishment for it at all? What Leviticus teaches the first little generation of Israel coming out of Egypt there is that no one is omitted from this process. If anyone sins, whether it be the high priest, Aaron himself, or Moses himself, all the way down to the what you may consider among yourselves as the lowest of the low of the people, everyone needs to bring a guilt offering. Everyone needs to bring a sin offering. No one is free from this. In our society, though, it seems as if you have enough money, you can do just about anything that you want to within reason, right? But this is not how things are ordered in Israel. In verse 13, we read, "Now if the whole congregation of Israel commits error, and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, and they commit any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and they become guilty, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, then the assembly shall offer a bull of the herd for a sin offering, and bring it before the tent of meeting." And then we see kind of the same thing. The elders lay their hands on the head of the beast. The priest dips his finger. They do this with the horns of the altar. They do this with this and this with that. And it just is producing this order and repetition to get it in the people's minds. If this book were to be written today, what it may have said is, if anyone at all commits any kind of thing and that they didn't realize, and they come to realize what they've done, then they do this thing and it be done with. But we have this repetition to keep it in their mind, to remind them that no one is exempt from this. Okay, the next thing that we see in verse 22 is a leader. So let's say it's not the priest or not the congregation of the people, but let's say it's one of the elders. What do? Same thing. He brings his goat. He brings it without defect. He lays his hands on it. The priest takes some, sprinkles it on the altar, all the way down. And then finally we get in verse 27. Now if any one of the common people sins unintentionally in doing any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done and becomes guilty, if his sin which he's committed is made known to him, then he shall bring for his offering a goat, a female without defect, for his sin which he has committed. If you're driving down the highway, and let's just pick out a vehicle. Let's say it's a beat up old, just an old Chevy. You've had it in the family. It's one of those things that's been passed down from generation to generation. It's got 2 million miles on it. You know the trucks I'm talking about. We've all driven them on our family's farms and whatever, things like that. But you're driving down the road in that thing, and you don't realize the speed limit changed from 55 to 40, and so you're still doing about we kind of keep it around 58 and a 55, right? You allow the radars to have a little bit of error, right? Well, so let's say you're going down the road. Yeah, you're 18 miles over the speed limit, and the policeman pulls you over. In terms of Leviticus chapter 4, it doesn't matter who he pulls over, whether it's the priest or the leader in the nicest car or the common person in a good truck, a reliable truck, but a little bit older and beat up truck. It doesn't matter who it is. The person's going to get the ticket. The person's going to have to pay the price. The person's going to be guilty of what the crime he's committed. But if you have someone driving down the road, let's say, and in a 2019, we'll just say a 2019 Bentley or something like that, and they get pulled over in a 40 mile per hour zone going 58 miles an hour, what are the chances that the police officer might look at him and say, yeah, you got a nice, how about if you invite me to the family barbecue this weekend? You see what I'm saying? There are certain situations where some people are treated differently because of their social class, because of whether they're man or woman. Or let's be honest, ladies, how easy is it to start tearing up a little bit and get out of a speeding ticket? Have you ever done that before? Do it? Nope, not Ashley. Ashley says, give it to me, I deserve it. My mom told me a story where the policeman pulled her over, and she looked down because she dropped her license in between her feet, and she said, oh no, I'm wearing the wrong shoes. She had 2 different shoes on. And the police officer said, sounds like you got enough problems, and let her go. What if a guy looked down and said, oh man, I'm wearing 1 boot and 1 tennis shoe, The what? Yeah, right. Ticket him twice. The point that we have though here in Leviticus chapter 4 is that everybody, if they're guilty, they have to pay the price. No one is exempt. And shouldn't that be the way that it is? Now I know that there's some situations where the officer will let you off for other reasons. But in terms of the big picture, shouldn't it be that if you're guilty of a crime, you have to do the time? Should you be able to get out because you're a little bit richer than somebody else, or a different skin color than someone else, or a different gender than someone else? Not at all. So when we read Leviticus chapter 4, this is just a radically different way that they had, way of life that they had experienced in Egypt. In Egypt, they were the lowest class citizens as slaves. Do you think they got off for anything from their taskmasters? Do you think their taskmasters gave them any kind of slack at all? Whereas the sons of Pharaoh are able to kill, are able to beat the slaves and do anything they want to without any repercussions. And if anyone does strike back, they have to flee into the wilderness for their life for 40 years. So what we have in Leviticus 4 is just a reordering of society. It is getting these people who are used to the world being ordered to us in a certain way and introducing them to this whole new way of living. The idea that the leader can be charged for the same crime as the common person and have to pay the same type of penalty. I mean, can you even imagine a society like that? Think how wonderful that would be. We talked about that before, that one of the problems with a lot of the penalties and why they don't work in today's world is because they're not consistent. One person murders someone and gets life in prison. The other person murders someone, but gets the death penalty. The reason why these punishments are not helping out society in any ways because they're not consistently applied. If they're consistently applied, if people knew what they were getting into when they committed that crime, then it would be more of a deterrent than not, in my opinion. Leviticus chapter 5, verse 1. Now, this is the cool thing about Leviticus. It's not just about sacrifices. You don't just read it for the details in the sacrifice. Read it for what's being said. Read it for the everlasting principle that's being taught. In this seemingly old and barbaric book of blood and shedding blood and sacrificing and all these kind of things is timeless principles that could work in any society. Like, for example, Leviticus chapter 5. Now, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration or a voice of oath to testify when he is a witness, whether he is seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell, then he will bear his guilt. Or if a person touches any unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean beast or the carcass of an unclean cattle or carcass of an unclean swarming thing, though it is hidden from him and he's unclean, then he'll be guilty. Or if he touches human uncleanness, of whatever sort his uncleanness may be, with which he becomes unclean, and if it is hidden from him, and then he comes to know it, he will be guilty. Or if a person swears thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, and whatever matter a man may speak thoughtlessly with an oath, and it is hidden from him, then he comes to know it, he will be guilty in one of these. Let's talk about some of the things that are mentioned here. A lot of it, when we use words like human uncleanness and animal uncleanness, that kind of throws us off a bit. But let's put it into perspective. First off, verse 1. What if, this is basically a justice system. If you have information about a case and you don't come forth with that information, then you're going to be guilty for withholding that, you see. That's a principle that we still hold true today, right? Where someone swears under oath to tell all the truth and nothing but the truth, and they find out that they've lied about something or they withheld information or they didn't give a full answer, that person's going to be charged, right, with obstructing the whole justice process. But when you look at verse 2, that might seem more out of touch to us. But think about it like this. What did they not know then that we know now? Now, obviously, God knows. But what did the people not understand? Germs and bacteria, spreading diseases, and things like that. And so what they had under the Old Covenant was a system of washing and sanctification, where if you came into touch with something that was unclean or someone that was dead, then you had to go through certain washings and certain days of purification before you could be introduced back into society. What do we do now? We wash our hands and take baths regularly, right? We regulate the food industry to where these types of diseases aren't introduced into society, at least if at all possible. When there's some kind of word out that there is some sort of disease in a type of meat, that meat's recalled, right? And you're told not to eat it. And if you do eat it, you have certain steps you take so that you don't spread the disease or become afflicted with any kind of disease. So what we have in Leviticus chapter 5 is responsibility of cleanliness. Don't we need that in our society still? And so when you read some of this, though, even the thing about swearing thoughtlessly, whether to do evil or to do good, you're guilty if you don't keep the oaths that you commit. And so when this happens, what you find in verse 6 is you bring this guilt offering and you offer it before the Lord. If you can't afford a lamb, in verse 7, what you see, you can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And you make the offering and you bring it forth and they sprinkle the blood and all these things. If you look down to verse 11, even if you can't afford 2 pigeons, you can bring, if you can't bring pigeons, you can bring flour for the sin offering. So all through this here in Leviticus chapter 5, it's setting up for anyone to have opportunity to make right what has been done wrong. In a tight-knit community of people that are traveling through the wilderness into the promised land, it's necessary to have this system where people can know what they can do exactly to make amends. If you look at verse 15, we see similar things. If a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, he shall bring his guilt offering, as you see there. But notice what he says in verse 16. He shall make restitution for that which he has sinned against the holy thing, and he shall add to it a fifth part of it and give it to the priest. The priest shall then make atonement for him with the realm of the guilt offering, and it will be forgiven him. Now what we're getting into in Leviticus is not just offering up animals, but restoring a fifth of the thing that you owe. And so if you owe a certain, if you owe a certain measure each week, and you don't produce that measure, then what he says is, all right, add a fifth to it to make up for what to make up for the sin that you've committed. It's kind of a preventative sort of thing. On down here in Luke chapter 6, we get into it even more in verse 2. He says, right, Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 2, when a person sins and acts unfaithfully against the Lord and deceives his companion in regard to a deposit or a security entrusted to him, or through robbery, or if he has extorted from his companion, or has found what he has lost and lied about it and sworn falsely, so that he sins in regard to any one of the things that a man may do, then it shall be when he sins and becomes guilty that he will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by extortion, or the deposit which he entrusted to him, or the lost thing which he was found, or anything about which he swore falsely, and shall make restitution for it in full, and add it 1/5 more. He shall give it to the one whom it belongs on the day he presents his guilt offering. This is more than just offering up sacrifices. This is about restoring things that you've stolen or taken advantage of somebody over. This is about what happens when you fail to keep a promise, a financial promise to someone. This is what happens whenever you find something and you don't tell anybody that you found it, even though it belongs to someone else, and you know that it belongs to someone else, and keep it for yourself. This is about how to live in a functional society and to love your neighbor as yourself and to be at peace with everyone. The guilt offering that we read about here in Luke chapter 4 and Leviticus chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 is a representation of your guilt. It's a representation of to show that you have repented. And these extra steps are how to right what has been wronged. So do you see that there's more to Leviticus than just offering up sacrifices? It's about how to form a functional society for a group of slaves, of freshly freed slaves that have come out of Egyptian captivity. It's about how the world should be ordered, and how we have a responsibility to those around us to restore things that were stolen, or things that were taken, or promises that weren't kept, or loans that we take out that we don't repay, and things like that. And so Leviticus is deeper and it contains timeless principles than what we typically think. Let's go to our New Testaments now, to Hebrews chapter 9, and talk a little bit more about these sacrifices. Hebrews chapter 9. All right, so at the same time, we need to think about the purpose of these sacrifices. It's kind of like what we read about in Matthew chapter 6 today, and that is that God doesn't need our prayers. That's not something that He's lacking. He's all-sufficient. But those prayers are more for us. It's more for us to voice our concerns, for us to have a communication with God and our relationship with God, and talk to Him like we talk to a friend. The same thing is true with the sacrifices. As Jaden read for us in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1, the blood of bulls and goats doesn't take away sins. That doesn't, remove your sin in any way. You don't become magically, everything's not magically good just because you make a sacrifice. In fact, what did we just read in Leviticus? If you wrong somebody, you have to make it right. Jesus said in Matthew 5, if you've wronged your brother, don't just go take a sacrifice to the offering. You got to go make it right with your brother, then take the sacrifice to the offering. If you bring the offering there and you realize that you haven't made up for what you've done or made things right, drop the offering at the altar, go make it right, then come back and offer it. So the point is that it's not the offerings within and of themselves don't do anything, but it's what they represent. It's the attitude that they change. God doesn't need those sacrifices, but they're more for us to show to us and to the people to make us give up something. To make us purchase maybe a turtle dove, or purchase a lamb, or purchase a goat, or bring one out of our own crops that we've raised, to show that we're truly sorry for the act that we've done. But anybody can bring a goat. Anybody can purchase a turtle dove. but it's something else to make right what you've done wrong. When we look at Hebrews chapter 9, we see the differences between these old covenant sacrifices and the sacrifice that we have under the new covenant. In Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 6, the scripture says, "Now when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed, while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly," he says, "both gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drinks and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation." All right, let's stop right there and talk about why the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. So again, like we mentioned a second ago, just offering up something doesn't make it right. And from God's perspective, you're not actually, if you just offer up the offering, you're not actually really, doing anything to make things right. Sure, you're fulfilling the requirements of the law of Moses, but your sins are not taken away just because you've offered up a bull or a goat. You are considered forgiven for the time being, but a remembrance of those sins is had every year. Some people talk about sins rolling over and things like that. He says that these offerings were basically just to hold them over, basically just to lead them to the Christ, lead them until the time of Reformation. What we see with the difference between the blood of bulls and goats and the sacrifice of Christ is this. When Christ appeared as high priest of the good things to come, he entered to the greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation. And not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, he entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats, of goats and bulls, and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? In the sacrifices that are offered in the Old Testament, one of the key things that are missing out of those is love. When you offer up something out of your own flock, or you pay for something to be offered up out of your own bank account, that's not a gift that is given to you by God, but that is a debt that you're having to pay. And with that debt that you're having to pay still comes grief. It still comes a remembrance of those things year after year, because you have to continually offer up more things to repay more debt. You continually have to bring these things over and over and over again, year after year. But with the sacrifice of Christ, one of the key differences between those old covenant sacrifices and the one for the new is that it was a gift to us. It was not something that we raised. It was not something that we have to pay for, but it's something that's given to God, or rather given to us from God, and it's a complete expression of his love. In Romans chapter 5, what we read about there is that the sacrifice of Jesus was done while we were still ungodly. He says, while we were still helpless, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, verse 7. Though perhaps for the good man some would dare to die, but God demonstrates his love toward us, and that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. So what we find in Romans chapter 5 that's different than the sacrifices of the Old Covenant that are talked about in Hebrews chapter 9 is that one compels us to go, well, I offered up this sheep. I better go get more money so I can purchase another sheep when I sin the next time. The one says, well, I've offered up this goat. I need to go tend to my goats so I can have more baby goats so I can offer up another sacrifice, next month or next week or next year. What the sacrifice of Jesus does, though, is God saying to the people, no, you are loved. I love you even though you've sinned. I love you even though you're ungodly. And this is a way that I've supplied, not that you've supplied, for you to not only be forgiven, but to forgive yourselves for the things that you've done. The sacrifice of Jesus is the perfect expression of God's love towards us, because it wasn't just us offering up something else, but it was God offering up himself on the cross on our behalf to show us that he loves us, to prove to us that we don't have to offer up sacrifices year by year, but we can trust in him and trust in his grace and trust in his mercy, understanding that Jesus' sacrifice is able to cleanse our conscience, and it doesn't force us to serve the living God. If we disobey Christ, we're not going to be killed. If we reject God's offering, we're not going to have to pay some sort of debt here. Eternally, we have a different story. But here, what God's love does for us is it compels us to follow him. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. My version, I think, says controls us. Basically, you're so overwhelmed by the love that God has shown you that you follow him no matter what. It's not a matter of debt that you're repaying, but it's a life of gratitude, of thanksgiving, and appreciation towards God and towards the love that you've given. The works that we do, that is, are in terms of our obedience, are not matters of debt, but are matters of thankfulness and gratitude. Jesus paid the debt. Jesus paid the price for us. His offering is complete, and we don't have to offer up anything else in that sense, in the sin sacrifice and guilt sacrifice anymore. Those debts have been paid. All we have to do is show our thankfulness to God through the way that we live. So what we read about in Hebrews chapter 10 is this in verses 1 and following. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form or very image of the things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually, year by year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any conscience of sins. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me, quoting Psalm 40 and verse 6. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, you have taken no pleasure. Therefore, then I said, behold, I've come in the scroll of the book, it's written of me, to do your will, O God. Now wait a minute. He says that God doesn't desire burnt offerings and sacrifices. God doesn't desire them to. God doesn't desire these other types of sacrifices and guilt offerings and grain offerings and things like that we've read about. That's what he says. Then why did he command them in the Old Testament? The commands were for the people, or for the community, not for God. He doesn't need those things. And so in verse 8 he says, after saying above, sacrifice and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. Verse 10 he says, by this will we've been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So he says ultimately this law was shown to be temporary because it was not sufficient to take away sins. God doesn't take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices. He's glad that that the children of Israel followed these laws to bring peace among the community and bring peace for themselves. But he says ultimately what God wants is for us is for will to be done, his will to be done, for us to follow him. The ultimate way that you get someone to follow you is not through lording over them, but through showing love towards them and compelling them to follow you through that love. A child who is now obviously we discipline our children, that's not a question of that, but a child who is abused and who has things required of them in order to be pleasing in their family's eyes, what are they going to do when they turn 18? They're going to be gone. But a child who has shown their whole life that they're loved and that the parent makes sacrifices for them and that they do things not out of obligation, although sometimes that might be the case, but ultimately they do those things out of thanksgiving towards their parents and out of wanting to show gratitude towards their mom and dad for loving them, and they followed the commands out of respect and not out of obligation. That child's going to come to every family reunion and share in every sense of fellowship with the family for years and years and years. What we have in Hebrews chapter 10 is changing the way that we view God and understanding how he views us. We don't do things out of obligation, just because there's commands, but we follow God because we've been compelled by His love to do so. We've been overwhelmed in gratitude. The types of offerings that we offer up are not sin offerings and guilt offerings, but offerings of thanksgiving and peace and love. What we find in Hebrews chapter 10 is that the reason why the new covenant is so much better is it's not one of obligation, but of privilege. We're not obligated to do these things, but we respond to the gift of God by doing these things because we're privileged to do so and are pleased to do so. Romans 12, verse 1 and 2 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. I mean, it's something that you naturally do out of response to the love of God. It's not like the Old Covenant, where things are offered year by year by year, but it's something that you do every day and every night out of love towards God. That's how we have the change from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. That's one of the changes there. The point, though, is that these sacrifices discussed in Leviticus 1 through 6 that we've covered are more for the people. They're more for ordering their society, teaching them how to live among themselves and how to be civil with one another and how to express that you're truly sorry for something. Ultimately, it's not the final solution. Ultimately, it's leading to something else, and that something else is the Christ and the sacrifice that Jesus made. Ultimately, this old covenant was temporary, containing timeless principles, but still temporary, leading us to an understanding of the new covenant. When you look at it from this perspective, though, what you see is Leviticus come alive. It's not just mundane repetitions of sacrifices, but a whole new way to order the world for the people so that they can live at peace among themselves, at peace with God, know exactly what's required, and stand out among all the nations as God's chosen people. And ultimately, of course, prepare the way for the Lord. What you have in the remainder of these chapters, if you want to go back and read them, is just further specifications on how the offerings are to be made and what the priest is supposed to do in each offering. That being said, we all have opportunities, not just today,